going to talk about H2 Ohio and Ohio's Domestic Action Plan. First up today, we have Sandra Cossack-Sills. She's an environmental specialist at the Ohio Lake Erie Commission. She is lead senior staff for the state of Ohio's Domestic Action Plan and the State of the Lake Erie Report Lake Erie Quality Index. She holds a PhD and an MLA in landscape architecture and an MS and BS in biology from the University of Michigan. And with that, Sandra, I welcome you and look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I just have a couple of slides. I'm really here just to introduce ODA and to set a little context. And my slides may also be put in their presentation, so if that's the case, you guys can just skip through them. I just want to say by way of a little context here, in talking about the Domestic Action Plan, we've been working on variations of nutrient reduction for the state of Ohio since 2015, when the Western Basin Collaborative was signed. And so, you know, some of these efforts have been going on for a couple of years now. And so under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, the domestic action plans were required of the federal governments of the United States and Canada. And in the United States, the states are cooperating with the federal government to each of us do our own domestic action plan, and these were due in 2018. Ohio has taken the point of view that this is a living document, and so we have been updating it as we have gone along, as strategies have adapted. We tried some different things along the way, and so that's just to put a little bit of context to it. In the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, the goals, Annex 4 is the annex that addresses nutrient reduction. And the two kind of aspects of that that are most relevant in Ohio are looking at harmful algal blooms in the Western Basin, because our tributary watersheds empty into the Western Basin, and then also low oxygen levels in the bottom of the Central Basin. And both of those issues are believed to be primarily or at least substantially influenced by nutrients, particularly phosphorus, that are discharged from the tributaries and go into the lake. In Ohio's Domestic Action Plan, the most recent update that we've completed on this past year, there's 4 sets of actions that we're focusing on at this time. The first one is agricultural best management practices, and that's what ODA will be talking to you about in just a minute here. The second one is wetland restoration and enhancements. That is the purview of Ohio Department of Natural Resources. The third one is community support, in particular for home sewage treatment system remediation, and those efforts are being led by Ohio EPA. And the fourth piece is watershed planning. And we also looked at doing a distribution of the required load reduction throughout the Maumee River watershed, work that was supported by Ohio EPA's nutrient mass balance efforts, and they have just published the latest round of that this past December. So this is our context. We have these 4 sets of actions. We have focused a lot on the first 2 because we are looking at our non-point source from our outlying areas in the state as being one of our biggest sources, and that's the information in the nutrient mass balance tells us. And so we do have Director Dorothy Pallanda of the Ohio Department of Agriculture here with us today to speak more specifically about what ODA is doing. And so I'm going to turn it over to ODA at this point. And can you guys switch the presenter, or do I have to do something?
I will switch the presenter. Should I hand this to Director Pallanda or Kirk?
Well, Kari, before we do that, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about Director Pallanda and Kirk Hines.
Great, thanks.
Oh, thank you, Sandra. Thank you very much. As Sandra said, we're moving on to Director Dorothy Pallanda from the Ohio Department of Agriculture. Dorothy is the 39th Director of the Ohio Department of Agriculture and the first woman to serve as Director in the department's history. Her great-great-uncle, Gideon Leggett, served on the Ohio Board of Agriculture, their precursor to ODA, in the early 1900s. Pallanda lives on a small family farm on which she grew up in Union County. She served in the Ohio House of Representatives from 2011 to 2019, served on the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. Dorothy also practiced law in a private practice for almost 30 years. She is a graduate of Marysville High School, Miami University, and the University of Akron School of Law. Dorothy is married to husband Sam and has 3 adult children. And while I'm on a roll, I'll talk about Kirk Hines as well. Kirk Hines is the chief of the Ohio Department of Agriculture's Division of Soil and Water Conservation. Hines, a professional engineer, oversees efforts to assist Ohio's 88 soil and water conservation districts with technical and administrative oversight in implementing soil and water conservation and agricultural pollution abatement programs. Hines was selected as chief of the new division in December of 2015 when the Soil and Water Program moved from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to ODA. Hines graduated from the Ohio State University with a bachelor's degree in engineering. He helps his father and brother with a 1,000-acre family grain cropping and beef cattle farm in Fairfield County. He resides on the farm with his wife Shelley, twin daughters Caitlin and Cassidy, and son Caden. And with that, Director Pallanda, I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, John. We're honored to be here. And I know some of you on this call have heard some of our presentation, but H2 Ohio is ever changing. And we are so excited with what lies ahead for H2 Ohio in this coming year. I think back a year ago to this time when we were just really beginning to commit to the practices that through the Department of Agriculture we would decide to fund, knowing that based upon the best science and data available, these would be practices that would really move the needle forward in terms of reducing phosphorus load in the Lake Erie region. The most significant thing to me was that very first meeting on February 8th in Perry County. I think we had set up the chairs for about 60 people, not knowing whether or not there would be any interest in the producers who would come to hear what we'd have to say. That day we had over 300 producers, and over the course of the next 7 meetings, the numbers just increased. There was a meeting where we had almost 900 producers come to hear what we had to say about how they could participate in voluntary conservation practices with the help of ODA. It was amazing. You could hear a pin drop in these rooms. I remember one night it was a blizzard, and finally the sheriff arrived and had said, you know, folks, we really need to come home. People refused to move out of the doorway, which was open because there was no more room in the meeting room. People wanted to hear what we had to say. How exciting that was. By August of last year, we had almost 2,000 producers committed to enrolling over 1.1 million acres in ODA's proposed best management practices plan. COVID-19 stood to stand in the way of moving forward, but thanks to Governor DeWine's commitment to clean water for all Ohioans, he found a way to fund that very first year. The legislature too was very receptive, and you know, knowing that the legislature had a large part to play in future funding, we've kept our relationships and our communications with those important legislatures going. I'm so excited to say that we have year 2 funding fully in place, and now we're focused on ensuing years, because all of us know that it's going to take many, many years and a long-term commitment from these producers so that we can really achieve the results that we want to achieve. Today, I'm joined, as you know, by Kirk Hines. And Kirk is going to speak for a few moments, but then turn the most of the meeting over to Clark Hudson, who I have hired as the regional director for H2 Ohio in the Maumee Basin. The work that these 14 soil and water district offices have done this past year has been nothing short of phenomenal. They work endless hours every day to reach out to the producers, to make sure they understand the commitment they've made, that they signed the documents that need to be signed, and that they have ongoing educational sessions with the soil and water district officers and the producers to make sure that everybody understands what is happening in the program, the changes that are happening, and how we are moving forward. I cannot thank Governor DeWine enough for his commitment to this, for his belief that these are the right things to do, and for the legislature's commitment. I also want to close by saying I am so proud and so pleased of our friendship with TMACOG, because together I believe that we can move forward with some great results. You are a group of experts. You're a group of people who are passionate, as we are, about the Lake Erie region. And we count on you to keep us informed of the issues that you're concerned about, to partner with us and to join with us in encouraging producers to be committed to this program. We're also very pleased with our ongoing working relationship with Sandra, whom you've heard from today, and also our partnerships with Heidelberg and OSU, because research is such an important part of this. And it is always developing, always interesting, and always provides a unique aspect, something that we have not heard before. Before I turn it over to Clerk, I would like to say one last thing. If you have not obtained a copy of the December issue of National Geographic, whose title article is Saving the Great Lakes, I encourage each and every one of you, buy it on Amazon. Go to your local bookstore and see if you can find it. It's a fantastic article. Lots of new and startling information, really, about our Great Lakes, but also some great information about what Ohio's doing, what Heidelberg is doing, and is really an inspirational magazine that I know I will keep for a long time and refer to. So with that, I'd like to turn the program over now to Kirk.
Awesome. Thank you, Director. So, today I think we want to really talk about implementing H2 Ohio, and Clark and I are going to try to do that. And I just wanted to kick it off. And when we talk about implementation, I think it's important to introduce ourselves, which the Director did well, but sort of the staffing and how we're assembling and then how we're moving out. And so, what we've done and what the Director did right away was look at H2 Ohio statewide, as you all know. And we have Terry Mesher, the lead in agriculture for H2 Ohio statewide. Terry's a professional engineer, has a lot of agriculture experience. So Terry will be working as we expand throughout Ohio and how we implement programs. Starting though, we knew that we were going to focus in the Maumee and in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So she certainly turned to one of our best in Clark Hudson, and Clark will be the coordinator just for that, for the Western Lake Erie Basin. And here in a minute, he'll talk about the programs that we have there. And, Clark has a lot of experience with ag education, certainly with OSU Extension, working with SWCD. So we thought that would really be key, both of those, to connect us, if you think about it, with all of our participants and really all of our partners in this program. Two other individuals that really make up our current team that I think it's important to identify, just more of the programs and what they're focused on. And the first is Kip Studer. But what Kip is focused on is nutrient management planning. And that's really what we've set as priority one, and our foundation for H2 Ohio is that base nutrient management plan. And then if there's a piece of the puzzle that I've not referred to you, that would be Peter McDonough. And that would be really looking at, as I'm sure you're all thinking about, well, how are you going to manage this data? How are you going to collect the data? And then we talk a little bit about the Ohio Agricultural Conservation Initiative, and I'll talk on that real briefly, but Peter will be coordinating with those. So that's really our team. Clark in just a second is going to talk about here and now, what we're specifically doing in the Maumee. But I want to just talk a little bit broader real quick. And, we get so many questions, whether it be Maumee or statewide, we sort of understand the practices you're doing now, but what's next? And how does the state plan to keep this going? And just really want to assure that, H2 Ohio is really looking over a long period and a long term. And we're thinking about that. And I always relay this in 3 areas. The first one is just maintenance. So, thinking about what we'll do after the BMPs are implemented. How do we maintain those for a long period? The second area really is expansion. So, already we're talking about moving out beyond Maumee, getting into the Western Lake Erie Basin. How can we get into the other areas of the state? And that becomes easier once you get programs up and running and you hit that maintenance phase, and then you get into the expansion. And then probably the third and most important area is really these partnerships. And we talk here a lot about certification, and that would be the Ohio Agriculture Conservation Initiative, which really is a certification program being done by the environmental groups and organizations, by the agricultural groups and organizations, but really just to do that to certify producers that are implementing the best management practices. So as we think long-term, that becomes really important in terms of that certification and maintenance, so that we can connect into that program, that we can link in, and that will continue it for many years. And what's really excited for us and organizations like TMACOG and many others with these sort of programs is, if you think about it in all the different categories that we can think about in terms of non-point agriculture, and that could be soil testing, that could be soil health, it could be water management, but all those come out in a certification program, and that's where we can all of our organizations can invest in, pick where we want to see what agriculture is doing and invest in those programs. So I think I just wanted to share that long term, we're really starting to think about that a lot and starting to plan to the future. And so you'll hear a lot more on this as we move forward. But I think for today, most importantly, I want to turn it over to Clark, and we'll really talk about just what we're doing specifically right now in the Western Lake Erie Basin and in the Maumee Basin. So Clark.
Thank you, Kirk. I'm just sharing my screen. Can you all see the cover slide of my presentation?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Well, as Kirk and Director of Planning said, my name is Clark Hudson. I have been living in the Western Basin since 1989. I moved up to the Northwest Ohio from Lancaster, where, as Kirk mentioned, I started my career as a vocational agriculture teacher. I've worked in ag retail in Paulding County, and then I've worked in for Ohio State University Extension as a county extension agent in Seneca County for about 8 years, and then came over to the Division of Soil and Water when we were still at ODNR in 2004. So I've been with the division for about 16 years, and in various roles, but all of them working directly with the soil and water conservation districts. And so when it came time to implement H2 Ohio, and since the soil and water conservation districts are such a important integral partner of that for us, it made perfect sense for me to shift into this role and act as the coordinator for H2 Ohio for the Western Lake Erie Basin. As I said, I live in Seneca County in Tiffin now, and so the folks around me, my neighbors who farm, are all excited about the hope for a future expansion of H2 Ohio in the coming year or years. So this presentation is very similar to the presentation I made to your Ag Committee back in November, and I also presented to the OARC in December. And talking to Carrie, she thought there would probably be, and others, that there'd probably be about a 25 to a 30% overlap. So for some of you, you have seen nearly all or most of this presentation. I hope that maybe in the time since you last looked at it, you might have come up with some additional questions, and we'd be happy to answer those either through the chat or at the end of the presentation. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to turn it back over to Kirk to talk about, let me make sure I can get my, too many windows open on my screen right now to get to the presentation. Hold on just a second, I apologize. Now, okay, I think that should be all right. So, as Sandra and others said, the object is this program is to improve water quality in the Western Basin and throughout Ohio, and H2 Ohio goes statewide. From the Department of Agriculture's role, we're looking primarily at nutrients, at soil erosion, and water. And we have 7 of the 10 practices, and hopefully, I'm going to turn my, I'm getting a little bit of, I'm going to turn my camera off, so hopefully you'll still be able to see the presentation, but it won't infect my upload speeds of the data. We're concentrating on the first 7 practices through the Department of Agriculture. These are all land-based practices, and we're working with private landowners to get these practices implemented. Well, no, it's very choppy today. Apologize for that. As the director and Kirk mentioned, the voluntary nutrient management plan, nutrient management planning is the bedrock of sound agronomics. We have the capability of doing soil testing either at a field level or even smaller units of as far down as a ½ acre, 2 acres, 5 acres. So we can find what nutrients are needed in that specific location in the field or in that particular field. But the only way we can do that is if we get a good representative soil sample for that field or that area and have it tested, and then we can come up with a strategy for what nutrients are actually needed to grow the crops that the producer is expecting or attempting to grow on those acres. So we can't do any of the rest of the program really without a good nutrient management plan. So when we first introduced this plan, you might have seen some of the brochures with soil testing as the first practice. We very quickly morphed that into a nutrient management plan because simply getting soil tests does not solve the problem or solve the issue. You have to take those soil tests and enact them on an acre by acre basis or on a field by field basis to make sure you're only utilizing the nutrients that you need on that field or on that acre. And the next step, if you're doing good soil testing, especially if you're doing good soil testing, variable rate application or VRT is simply precision agriculture. That's being able to place the nutrients exactly where they're needed in the amount that they're needed in. So that means that you could have a wide range of rates of phosphorus in an individual field. Each 2.5 acre grid, as the equipment drives across the field, the rates of the nutrients are varied by a computer in the equipment, and we're only putting on the nutrients that we need. So that's a practice that a lot of producers had dabbled in, and this practice, we're hoping through H2 Ohio that we get a much greater uptake of this practice. I'm not going to bore you with all the financial components of the practice. You can see them on the slides as we go through them. If you've got questions as we go through this or at the end, I would be pleased to answer those questions. Subsurface placement. Essentially, this is equipment that allows the nutrients to apply directly into the soil using some type of a knife or shaft that's putting the nutrients, the phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium directly into the soil. It's in better seed soil contact. It gets in contact with soil moisture. It gets inculcated into the soil matrix, and it does not move as rapidly. Placing soil or placing amendments on the surface or nutrients on the surface exposes them to rain and snow and other environmental factors, and we see a greater loss when they're applied to the surface. So applying them subsurface is kind of the next stage to keep the nutrients in place. Manure Incorporation, and it's kind of a little bit of a, we've talked about this. We're really encouraging more than just a manure incorporation. We are only paying producers that apply manure and either inject it directly into the soil, or they incorporate it within 24 hours. The other component of this practice is we realize that a lot of manure under old farming systems was applied to the fields that were closest to the barn. So a lot of those fields have extremely high soil test levels and do not need any additional nutrients. So the scheme for this program and this practice, and the reason that the prices we're paying are much higher than some of the other practices, is to help offset the cost of transporting those nutrients, transporting that manure to fields farther away from the homestead or the farm or the barns and put them on fields where soil test levels are below the maintenance level and are needed. In doing that, we are going to be offsetting commercial fertilizer that is being imported into the basin. We will need less commercial phosphorus and thereby reducing the total amount of phosphorus loading in the basin, because we're actually bringing less phosphorus in, utilizing the phosphorus that we already have here in the manure in a more sustainable system. Conservation crop rotation, and there's 2 slides on this. I'm going to do most of the discussion on the first slide, but they all apply the same to the forages as well. One of the problems we've seen in the difficulties we have in the basin and in agriculture across the United States in general, we have gone from 3 and 4 and 5 year rotations where we had corn, soybeans, wheat, forages, hay, to a 2-year rotation of corn and beans, just based on economics. That leads us to a problem of having crops in the field from early April to mid-October or even November, and we do not have a very good window to apply nutrients when we really desire to do that, which is late July through early September, in that late summer, early fall window, when historically it's been drier, so we have less rain, we have less runoff, and they have the opportunity to either incorporate those nutrients and then plant a cover crop on top of them. So we just decrease the loss of nutrients in that way. So this practice is designed, and the forage practice are both designed to increase the windows we have in more optimal timing to apply nutrients to help ensure that they stay where we put them, and also to keep a soil cover on that soil in the winter months when that soil is exposed to more rain in early spring and we see more erosion. That leads me right into the last field crop practice, overwintering cover crops. Again, if we can, even in a 2-year rotation, if we can encourage the use of cover crops following corn or following soybeans and keeping cover on that field year round, essentially, we're going to greatly reduce the amount of erosion through surface erosion and greatly reduce the amount of nutrients that are lost through that as well. So those are our field practices. We do have one additional practice that we are utilizing, and that is drainage water management. With other programs, GLRI, and in the past, we have installed several thousand drainage water management structures, and these structures essentially are stop log structures that will allow us to stop the drainage from a field or greatly reduce the drainage from a field at any given time. They're installed on a tile or a tile main. You have a manual control valve that the producer can raise or lower, so that when they need to be in the field to do field work, they can raise those logs up, lowering the water table level, letting the water drain out, do their field work, and then after they're done planting or they're done in the spring, they can push those logs back down and increase the water table back up so that that water is not leaving the field in late summer or late spring or early summer. It's staying in the field as nutrients can be utilized to crops. An additional benefit of this, the non-agronomic from our standpoint, is that that water then is not lost and can be utilized by the crops in drier months. So we would encourage these structures to be in place and utilized during the summer when they don't need to be in the field. They lower them back, they lower the water table in the fall, harvest the crops, do their fall tillage work or whatever they need to do in the fall, put the logs back down and raise that water table back up over the winter time and kind of reduce the flow off of those acres. Depending on the size of the drainage area, we have two price points for this practice, because one involves doing tile mains, which are larger and more expensive, and the others are on just a regular lateral tile. As the director said, we were all, just tremendously blown away by the interest that we had at the 8 meetings that we rolled out. We had over 2,100 farmers that registered. We estimated that we had about 2,500 total people at those 8 events. We received 2,000 applications in February and March in our initial sign up, and that accounted for about 1.2 million acres in voluntary nutrient management plans. That's the practice that essentially needs to be done on almost every acre. There are some exceptions if a producer already has a CNMP, a comprehensive nutrient management plan, because they are a livestock producer. We may not have those acres captured, but we're pretty confident that 1.2 million acre number was actually slightly below estimates, but that's about 40% of the total 14 counties. We had to kind of take a step back when COVID hit. We just couldn't implement the program last summer because we couldn't get agreements out to producers. The producers couldn't sit down with the soil and water districts or their fertilizer dealer and draw up their nutrient management plan. So we kind of had everything pushed back a year. So we were able to relaunch our program over last summer. In that, we had about 1,918 agreements that we offered to producers in 14 counties. We are at over 1,800 acres that we have signed agreements with producers, and the practices that they were allowed to start this fall were their nutrient management plan. They could install the controlled drainage structures last fall when the conditions were fit, and they could start their fertilizer applications for the crop year 2021 with variable rate application and subsurface placement. So if they wanted to go ahead and put the nutrients on in the best way possible this past fall, they could do that, and then they'll be ready to go in and plant this following spring. As the director said, we have received year 2 funding. We have begun a process with the Ohio Agribusiness Association and therefore our certified dealers to develop nutrient management plans, and along with soil and water districts approving those plans. They can be approved by a certified crop advisor or a certified dealer who is working in conjunction with, as Kirk mentioned, Kip Studer and Peter McDougall. They are kind of supervising that for that director's designee program. We got about $50 million in year 1, and we've got enough funding for year 2. We were waiting for the legislature, obviously, to provide funding for the last year. But we have, at this point, I looked this morning in our database, and we have 1.155 million acres enrolled in VNMPs. That's about 500,000 acres of VRT, 300,000 acres of subsurface placement, 160,000 acres of Manure Incorporation, and about not quite 600,000 acres in the conservation crop rotations and overwintering cover crops. And we expect to put in about another 450 drainage water management structures over the 3 years of this program. So the future, obviously full funding will be needed for the 3 years to reach our goal of 40% phosphorus reductions by 2025. We are working on expanding this program into the remaining 10 counties in the Western Basin. We've got a couple avenues for that, and I'll let Kirk take the first stab at maybe explaining that. And again, we are still working out the details. Many of you know that House Bill 7 was passed and then signed by the governor, I think, last week. We're still working out the details and what kind of effect or impact that will have on H2 Ohio as well. With that, I don't have any other slides to share with you. I would ask if you have any questions, or before questions, if Kirk wants to talk a little bit more about the future of the program, that would be fine.
Clark, great job. And, I don't have too much more, I think, in the essence of time. And, we'll just go ahead and go to questions and let Director Pallanda maybe close us out here. So, but just really excited for everything that's been shared and the opportunity. So nothing further from me.
Well, thank you. Given that, do we have questions for any of the presenters? You can unmute and ask your question now, or we may have something in the chat box. Let's ask questions. And Kari, do we have anything in the chat box?
Yes, we do. We have a few questions from Sandy Bin in the chat box, and I'm happy to read those. But I'll also, Sandy, I'll give you the opportunity if you'd like to ask your questions directly. Okay, I'll go ahead and read those. Sandy says, today the ODA is announcing a permit expansion for Sugar Lane Dairy in the Auglaize watershed from 2,000 dairy cows to 3,820 dairy cows. This is like adding 38,000 people, human sewage to the land applied. Is ODA going to require the soil phosphorus to be 50 parts per million, same as for manure applied via H2 Ohio? So that's the first question. And I'll continue with this. Also, how are additional animals, permitted and unpermitted, being documented, discussed, and added to mass balance and domestic action plans. So it looks like a two-part question, one for Director Pallanda, and Sandra, I think you can probably answer the second part of that question.
Okay, so I will go ahead and address the first section. You know, when we talk about permitting farms, I'm always of the opinion that permitting farms is what we want to do. If we have a farm that is under ODA's jurisdiction, this allows us to go onto their farms, to monitor what's happening, to penalize them if they are not following the program that we outlined for their farm, and to even shut them down. So it's the unpermitted farms, quite frankly, that cause me the most concern about what they're doing on their farm, how we do not have oversight over their farms. So I guess in essence, I would say as a general rule, one, we have indeed issued permits to various farms across Ohio, but I will tell you with every one of them, we have added conditions before granting the permit that are, in my opinion, are very cognizant and mindful of what we believe they need to do to be responsible with these expansions. Kirk, do you want to add a little bit more to that, especially with regard to the press release that apparently is going out today?
Yeah, Director, I would just add, you know, I think we do have requirements outlined. You know, we consistently look at those within our role package and the requirements. So as the Director said, each of these facilities get at least 2 inspections each year to oversee that the manure applications and those sort of things are done as required by code. So we feel like we're doing a fairly good job with that, and you know, very consistent in our approach, and just following what we have in our regulations and in our code as well.
Carrie, this is Sandy. Can you hear me? Okay. The question was really specifically on soil phosphorus. You know, H2 Ohio is paying $60 an acre for liquid manure to be hauled further away from the barns, and $35 an acre for poultry manure to go on land with 50 parts per million of phosphorus or less. This is an existing facility, so I'll have to look at the permit and see what the soil testing is. But are you going to limit the additional manure coming on here to the 50 parts per million as we're paying to haul it away? Why wouldn't a new permit, an added permit, have that 50 part per million requirement?
Sandy, this is Kirk, Director. I'll go ahead and at least answer from my perspective. You know, with H2 Ohio, we're certainly looking to go over and above those requirements and to really to get manure transferred as far as we can and see what impact that has, and looking really to replace a lot of that connection with crop farmers. So putting manure in areas where there was fertilizer before. So I think it, you know, as you know, Sandy, it makes a lot of sense when it's economical, certainly to move that manure and do those sort of things. But, you know, at the end of the day, we have to come back to what we have in code, what we have in regulation, and we look at that and feel like that's adequate. So I think from these permitted facilities, that's what we do. We go back to code and we look at what are those requirements that must be met. And so that's what's done in these situations. We've certainly made it to where, you know, these facilities, and we recommend these facilities look at H2 Ohio, you know, like many programs, and something that Director Pallanda wanted to make sure we did was that we not exclude facilities from H2 Ohio. So just because they have a permit, they're not excluded. Just because they're small, they're not excluded. We wanted H2 Ohio to incorporate everyone. So certainly we will be working with all the facilities, including the permitted facilities, to see what, you know, works for them in terms of H2 Ohio, whether it's cover crops, whether it's drainage water management, whether it's Manure Incorporation. So we think it does fit, Sandy. We think our codes are sufficient, you know, as currently written, and then that's something that we look at, you know, quite often, certainly every 5 years, work with the legislature to make sure those are met. So that's what I would be able to share in that situation.
Just quickly, the new NRCS 590 2019 recommendations actually suggest that an impaired watershed that this expanding dairy is located in, it's definitely impaired, would be required to actually kind of not have additional animals and get the soil phosphorus down to 20, so it's even lower. And that's NRCS guidelines for conservation funding. So I don't think Ohio is stepping up to have these more stringent requirements, and would ask that that happen. And also, just to make sure I get the last question in, on the H2 Ohio program, I have yet to see the estimated amount of phosphorus, both total and dissolved, that is estimated to be reduced within the watershed through this money.
Sandra, I don't know if you were going to answer that, or you wanted me to start.
I
If anyone-
can,
Go ahead.
okay, I can speak just a little bit to the estimated phosphorus reduction. H2 Ohio was designed in part, we based it a lot on our best estimates supported by what research was available for how much phosphorus we could expect to reduce for each of these practices. Now, this is research studies, not all of which were done in Ohio. So if you take an estimated amount reduced per acre that the practice is applied to and multiply it times the amount of practices that you have, you could come up with an estimate for how many pounds of reduction there would be. And then when you multiply it times the resources available for H2 Ohio, you can figure out whether enough resources have been put in the program to theoretically reach those reduction targets. If H2 Ohio were fully funded as it was originally conceived as a 10-year program, our estimates indicate that we should be achieving a 40% reduction, a little bit more than that actually. But again, you know, we have not emphasized that aspect of the program because of the uncertainty in the research results that underpin that analysis. But it's implied if you look at the cost curve graph that was printed in the domestic action plan. There's a certain number of millions of pounds of phosphorus that we are approaching to get to that number of metric tons annually that we want to reduce by. And so, you know, if you look at how far across the watershed we can put some of these practices, because we probably will not achieve 100% on any of them, you know, theoretically we can make it, we believe. But as a practical matter, you know, we need to enroll the program for a few years and do some further studies as ODNR is looking at getting some more specific data about the wetlands that they are actually constructing. We should be able to get a better estimate of that a little ways down the road. I don't know if ODA wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick. I think, Sandra, you hit it really well. You know, we think about three things. We think about the estimates and the models, and really that gets back to the top 10, top 7 practices Clark talked about. I think, you know, the third area, the last area that we looked at, obviously, is what's coming into the lake. That's where the rubber meets the road and what's very important. But we need to get practices implemented to see that change. And, you know, I think where we're at is somewhere in the middle to really start looking at what are we seeing at the edge of field. And what are we seeing from these practices where we can measure them at the edge of the field? And that's something that, you know, Director Pallanda has asked us to focus on. We've sort of done these estimates, and now let's look at what we're doing edge of field, and then hopefully that relates to, you know, 2025 or down the road what we see in the MOMI. So thank you.
John, I think that covers the questions in the chat box.
All right. Well, thank you, Kari. Any further questions before we move on?
I have one. Sandra, you had mentioned, you know, the H2 Ohio program was really intended to be funded for 10 years in order to meet the phosphorus reduction goals needed. This group actually heard from the sponsor of House Bill 7 last year that really did lay out the framework for a 10-year bonding mechanism to continue to fund this program. Director Pallanda did mention that bill passed. However, the funding mechanism component and the oversight committee part was stripped from that bill. So I would just mention that if you have any suggestions for how TMACOG can be helpful in really helping to push for continued funding of this program, I know our members would probably all agree, and we lay this out in our agenda for Lake Erie, that we would really like to see H2 Ohio funded long term in order to be able to really see any of these reduction goals met. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if there's anything that we can do on the advocacy side to ensure that the funds continue to be allocated toward this program.
Sure. Thank you for that, Kari. And I think Joy Mullinex is on the call. I don't know if Joy wants to chime in with any more on that. Perhaps not.
Thanks, Sandra. I am on the call. Absolutely. I want to thank TMACOG, you, Kari, for your support. Having Governor DeWine's commitment to funding is great, but then it also takes the supporters like TMACOG weighing in with the General Assembly to really make sure that funding can happen. And so if you can stand by for a couple of weeks, we can follow up on that conversation about funding. But yes, absolutely, as Director Pallanda laid out, you know, we will need to make sure that there is continued funding to maintain these efforts.
All right, well, thank you, Joy. Certainly want to thank and recognize our speakers, Director Pallanda, Sandra, Kirk, Clark. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. It's wonderful the collaboration we have with you, and we certainly look forward to continuing that